Berlin, the summer of 1940. In the capital of the Third Reich, Germans went about their daily business. It had been less than a year since Adolf Hitler had plunged Europe into war. The fact that German soldiers were in Poland, Scandinavia, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France was barely noticed at Berlin's Wannsee.
All in all, I don't think we should forget these were all campaigns that the Germans were able to live with easily, because they had remained completely free of all the effects of the war up to that point. And another essential element, the wars had been so short that the losses, from wounds or by actual deaths of the soldiers, had been very small.
Durch tatsächliche Todesfälle der Soldaten sehr, sehr gering gewesen sind.
At that time, waging war was still easy for the Germans. After all the lightning victories in Europe, Germans hoped that the last enemy in the war, Great Britain, would now give in and make peace with the Reich.
Actually, they didn't want England as an adversary, but as an ally. In this respect, speculation about whether things would then continue had calmed down a bit. But in hindsight, some Germans didn't quite know what to make of this precarious peace either.
On July 19, 1940, their leader, Adolf Hitler, made an official peace offer to England. The British did not dignify it with a response. Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the German Luftwaffe, was now responsible for the success of Unternehmen Seelöwe. Planning for the invasion of Great Britain had been going on for weeks. German airborne units were to take off from airfields in Belgium, Holland, and northern France to first conquer the airspace over the island. After that, German troops were to land on England's shores. The German Luftwaffe was well prepared. Since their devastating mission in the Spanish Civil War, their pilots had become adept at aerial bombing, Stuka attacks, and dropping incendiary bombs. After initial skirmishes over the English Channel, German airborne units began bombing the British mainland.
The Battle of Britain began on August 13th with the so-called Eagle Day, when stronger German bomber units attacked British industrial centers. At first, the Germans only attacked the British infrastructure, airfields, radar stations, and were relatively successful there as well.
Flugplätze, Radarstationen. Und sind auch relativ erfolgreich.
They believed that with a few days of air raids on British airports, one could smash the British air defense, the fighter command, and gain air superiority. And then, if Hitler wanted to, he could order a landing on the south coast as well.
Great Britain was expecting an invasion of the Wehrmacht, and so the men of the English Home Guard armed themselves against the enemy. The Germans had to be prevented from landing on the island by any and all means. To prevent Nazi landing craft from even reaching the Channel coast, the British had installed flamethrower systems there. With Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, the British had an avowed opponent of Hitler. He wanted to prevent Hitler's rule over Europe at all costs. Otherwise, as Churchill said, the world would sink into the abyss of a new dark age. The Prime Minister rejected any discussion of a negotiated peace with the Nazis.
Churchill was an interesting figure in that he initially admired Hitler. He wrote a portrait of him. In the early 30s, I think it was printed in 34 or 35. It's kind of famous, so he couldn't hide an admiration for Hitler's successes. And then only toward at the end of the 30s, when he saw that the whole matter would amount to a highly aggressive policy, which would ultimately also involve Great Britain, did he change his mind and say, we must fight this man.
Blood, toil, tears, and sweat, Winston Churchill prophesied for his people, and a war against a monstrous tyranny such as had never been surpassed in the dark catalogue of mankind's crimes, which must end only with victory at all costs. British combat morale was high. On August 25th, British bombers took off for the first air raid on the capital of the Third Reich. The inviolability of Berlin, noted German judicial official Friedrich Kellner in his diary, of which there had been abundant talk, had proved to be a vain haze. In the face of such attacks, Adolf Hitler clamored in Berlin's Sportpalast.
Wenn die britische Luftwaffe 2 oder 3 oder 4.000 Kilogramm Bomben wirft, dann werfen wir jetzt in einer Nacht 150, 180, 230, 300... Wenn Sie erklären, Sie werden bei uns Städte im großen Ausmaß angreifen, wir werden Ihre Städte ausradieren!
For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Germans were made aware of their own vulnerability. Despite various blitzkrieg victories, the Luftwaffe was unable to keep enemy plane formations out.
Berlin did not seem particularly impressed by this. What could be said, however, was that doubts about Göring's abilities and capacities to defend the Reich were beginning to grow.
Schon anfing, größer zu werden.
The Reichsmarschall then received orders from Hitler to target London in retaliation for the Royal Air Force's night raids on Berlin. On the afternoon of September 7, 1940, 364 German bombers took off, escorted by 515 fighter planes. Their target were the docks in the middle of the East End, a working-class neighborhood. On that first evening, more than 400 Londoners died and another 1,500 were seriously injured. In the air battles with the Royal Air Force, the German pilots suffered defeats, some of them heavy. Their losses by wounded, imprisonment, and death were significantly higher than those of the RAF. The British pilots fought over their homeland and were quickly ready for action again after an emergency landing. Their Spitfires and Hurricanes were fast and maneuverable. The German Air Force failed to gain air superiority over the island. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Unternehmen Seelöwe until the following spring. Eventually, the landing in England wasn't even attempted. For the first time, a nation had successfully defied the Nazis.
In a way, this was seen as not a bad thing. As one diarist said, "This was a terrible week for us, but it was not seen as a defeat." And conversely, it has to be said, also very importantly, the British did indeed see it as a victory. It was the first time that a nation had been able to put a stop to the Nazis. So for their self-confidence, it was an incredible boost, whereas the Germans tended to talk it down as, these things can happen.
Schritt, während die Deutschen es eher als kann mal passieren, kleingeredet hatten.
Im Rahmen verschiedener Zusammenkünfte mit den ausländischen Staatschefs begab sich der Führer zur spanischen Grenze.
At the end of October, Hitler traveled to Hendaye to meet Francisco Franco. The dictator urgently needed support against an England that was resisting fiercely. The Spaniards were to take Gibraltar from the British, but the meeting turned out differently than planned. Franco's special train arrived too late.
Auf dem Bahnsteig der französischen Grenzstation erwartet der Führer den Chef der spanischen Regierung. Die Ankunft des Sonderzuges. Zum ersten Male begegnen sich hier der Führer und der Caudillo.
The unity of the two fascist leaders, as depicted by the newsreels, was only a facade. Franco had no intention whatsoever of entering the war. He had ruled over a devastated Spain for only 18 months, which he had just gotten under control after 3 years of civil war and with German help. The Caudillo stayed out of it. Meanwhile, In order to put political and military pressure on England, the German Air Force continued to take off in the direction of Great Britain, but the Luftwaffe had problems.
When they sent bomber units to England, they always had to send fighter planes with them for escort and protection. And the problem with these fighters was that the fuel tanks were relatively small. They could only fight for a certain time in English airspace, sometimes only for 14 minutes, and then they had to immediately return. In other words, a German plane on a mission against Britain could only fight there for a short time, while a British plane could fight there for hours.
After the conquest of British airspace failed, thus putting a landing on the island out of reach, Hitler wanted at least to force an armistice. For this, the British arms industry had to be weakened, and at the same time, the morale of the British people had to be broken. Now, the civilian population was targeted.
In 1940, it seemed that bombing London was somehow a way to get Britain ready for peace.
The British called the attacks on their capital the Blitz, after the Nazi propaganda word blitzkrieg. In the weeks that followed, only a few days and nights passed without bombings. Again and again, the Luftwaffe carried out small, targeted attacks. Londoners had come to feel the hum of German Heinkels, Dorniers, and Junkers at all times. There were no air raid shelters in London. People took refuge in the subway stations, which saved the lives of tens of thousands. Some 650,000 children had already been moved to the countryside. Since the beginning of November, the bombers had been coming mainly at night. During Christmas week 1940, London experienced the most devastating conflagration since the city's Great Fire in the 17th century. But the British remained steadfast and pragmatic. Cardboard coffins, lime bags, and body pits were prepared in order to be able to quickly recover and deal with the fatalities.
What people in Germany tend to forget, however, is that German bombing raids in 1940 caused very high casualties among the British population, up to 40,000 deaths in the first weeks and months after the Battle of Britain began.
When Buckingham Palace was hit, King George VI and his wife Elizabeth escaped with a scare, but the royal couple stayed in London to assist their people.
The British didn't see it as a tax on the air armament industry. They saw it as a tax on civilians, that the Germans wanted to hit civilians. Naturally, the bombing was inaccurate because churches were also hit, because hundreds of people were killed. And then the amazing thing for the Germans, and maybe for the British, was that the civilian population came together. The morale didn't collapse. The British were far from capitulating. Actually, it was just the opposite.
Fiery speeches from their Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was determined to do whatever necessary, also strengthened the morale of the British considerably.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Starting in mid-November, the Air Force shifted the focus of its attacks and aimed primarily at industrial targets outside London. On November 14th, under the cover of Unternehmen Mondscheinsonate, German units flew a heavy night bombing raid on Coventry. The extent of the destruction was enormous. In the future, to Coventry was the name given to the destruction of a city from the air in the cynical parlance of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Visibly shaken, Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited the ruins of the historic St. Michael's Cathedral and the rubble of the industrial city in the heart of the British Isles the following morning.
Coventry was chosen because it was the center of the British aircraft engine industry. They were hit, but these aircraft engine factories were located in the city center. Spread around the city center, the whole city burned down, 500 dead. The term Coventrying was then used because of the great damage. But there was one thing that wasn't achieved, and that was lasting damage to the armaments industry, because after just a few weeks, it continued to produce at the old production levels.
The day before the devastating bombing of Coventry, British pilots took off on an airstrike. Target, Berlin. Stalin's foreign minister was expected there for talks. Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "We had heard of this conference beforehand, and though we had not been invited, we did not wish to be left entirely out of the negotiations." Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov arrived at Anhalt railway station. He was there to negotiate spheres of influence in Scandinavia and the Balkans for Stalin. Hitler, on the other hand, wanted to bring the Soviets into an alliance to secure himself against England. But Molotov was a difficult negotiator who did not trust the Germans. There was a memorable situation at the state banquet.
During the meetings with Hitler, Molotov had to go into the air raid shelter because there were attacks on Berlin. And he told Stalin that Hitler was a vegetarian and that no meat was available there. This may sound like a side issue, but it led to a decline in the Nazis' reputation in Moscow. They had to go to air raid shelters. They didn't eat meat. Strange people. He told Stalin about the limp handshake of Hitler, who seemed to him more like a feminine figure than a determined dictator. He made no impression at all on the Soviet side. That's quite interesting. And that's why Stalin was sure that Hitler wouldn't attack the Soviet Union. They wouldn't do that. They couldn't even protect Berlin from air raids.
Das werden die nicht machen. Die können ja nicht mal Berlin vor Luftangriffen schützen.
Formally, they were still allies. A non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union had existed for a year. Both countries had enriched themselves from the spoils of the German war, and Poland had been divided between them. But Stalin refused to officially ally with Nazi Germany. By September, two other nations had entered into a pact with the Third Reich. Here, Japanese Minister of War Tojo Hideki arrives in Berlin. The purpose of the visit from Japan was the signing of the so-called Three-Power Pact between Hitler's Germany, Italy, and Japan. The division of the world was regulated by treaty. Italy would receive the Mediterranean region as its sphere of influence, Japan, all of East Asia, and Germany, Europe, and the East. With this demonstration of strength, it was believed, especially in Tokyo, that the U.S. could be deterred from entering the war.
During this period, Japan was always concerned with finding partners and to be accepted as an equal partner. Hitler, who himself had very great territorial aspirations, naturally selected Japan as the ideal partner in Asia from a certain point on. But the problem was that these three powers, unlike the Allies, never found a common strategy. Each worked for its own interests. Whether in Europe, whether in Africa, the German Empire did something different than Italy, and cooperation with Japan never actually took place.
Der japanische General Yamashita, der sich als Führer einer militärischen Studienkommission in Deutschland aufhält, überbringt dem Oberbefehlshaber des deutschen Heeres, Generalfeldmarschall von Brauchitsch, als Geschenk der japanischen Armee ein Samurai-Schwert.
Such academic visits, actually tangible military advice, had a tradition. For a good 50 years, the Germans had been instructing the Japanese Empire in matters of war strategy.
Adolf Hitler's
Nazi Germany seemed to Japan to be a suitable ally. In addition, Japan was impressed to a certain extent by the fact that Hitler had this idea that we were dividing the world into three large spheres of influence. And these three countries together represented a bulwark, as a bulwark in ideological terms against Bolshevik Russia, the Bolshevik Soviet Union on the one hand, but also as an ideological and political bulwark against the Anglo-Americans, against London and Washington.
Gegen die Anglo-Amerikaner, gegen London und Washington.
Japan moved ever closer to its powerful German ally. In March 1941, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring received Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka at his Kadenhall estate. Hitler hoped to keep the United States out of war in Europe and instead tie it up in a conflict in Asia. Japan was to be encouraged to launch a rapid war of aggression in the Far East. Under the rule of Emperor Hirohito, the military was the most powerful institution in Japan. Hirohito supported the imperial claims of his generals. The Japanese army and fleet were removed from any parliamentary control and were directly subordinated to the emperor. Japan's military government was preparing to bring all of East Asia under its control. Since the First World War, the young industrial nation had been striving for dominance in the Asian region.
In Japan, on the political side and especially on the military side, there was always the view during that period that you were not an equal partner. Although militarily you waged war successfully in the Russo-Japanese War in World War I, after these wars that were waged successfully, militarily successfully, Japan had to concede certain things politically, and concede them to the West, and concede them to the West's liking.
Initially, Japan's colonial ambitions were directed against neighboring China. Manchuria, in the north of the country, was rich in raw materials. Nippon took advantage of the disunity of the giant empire, which was bleeding to death in the Civil War, and occupied the northern province in a coup d'etat. But Japan's hunger for raw materials wasn't satisfied. In 1937, Japan provoked another war with China, this time to conquer it completely. A civil war had been ravaging the giant Chinese empire for 10 years. After the rapid conquest of Beijing, Japanese units bombarded Shanghai. But Japan didn't succeed in completely conquering China. Instead, it turned south. In Indochina, Vichy France, which collaborated with the German ally, granted Japan the right of passage, the stationing of troops, and the use of airfields. Over the course of a year, Japan brought all of the country's major military bases under its control. Meanwhile, hardliner Tojo Hideki gained influence, so much so that the United States felt compelled to impose an official embargo against the Japanese empire.
The United States actually had two main interests in Asia. One was economic interests that they had to represent there. At that time, it was clearly understood that one of the coming markets, from a capitalist point of view, would sooner or later be Asia. On the other hand, it was also the case that there were raw materials in Southeast Asia in which the United States also had an interest. Also, in terms of security, the US had aspirations to continue to have a presence in the Asia-Pacific region.
Sicherheitspolitisch hatten die USA Bestrebungen, weiterhin im asiatisch-pazifischen Raum präsent zu sein.
One of the most important U.S. naval bases in Asia was in the Philippines. Nevertheless, no one there seemed to believe in a Japanese invasion. About 10,000 American soldiers were stationed there. Their equipment and weapons were mostly outdated, but the U.S. government was gradually turning the archipelago into a fortress. The President of the United States still hesitated to enter the war officially. On January 20th, 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in Washington. He was the first U.S. president to run for a third term. In his address, he made it clear on whose side the U.S. would be on in the future.
Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose. To that high concept, there can be no end save victory.
In a certain sense, the United States had entered the war indirectly. The US had supported its American partners in Europe, that is London, with armaments. Armaments also arrived in China, by the way. Japan's adversary, which of course didn't go unnoticed by Japan, and also played a major role. Japanese policy had moved more and more in the direction of anti-Americanism.
At the port of Halifax in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, freighters were loaded with American weapons and supplies that the U.S. was providing to Great Britain. In a blazing speech, Churchill had addressed Roosevelt and appealed for America's support.
Put your confidence in us. Give us your faith and your blessing. And under Providence, all will be well. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
German submarines repeatedly succeeded in torpedoing the ships loaded with equipment and weapons. But the Royal Navy struck back. Survivors of the sunk battleship Bismarck, once the pride of the German Navy, went ashore in Halifax.
Great Britain at that time still had the strongest navy in the world. The German Navy, which only upgraded in the 1930s, simply couldn't keep up with that. It did have big battleships like the Tirpitz, the Bismarck, but one was sunk very quickly. The other was just lying around in harbors and was also sunk towards the end of the war. So the big German Reich, the Germans' navy, couldn't keep up with the Royal Navy at all.
In October 1940, Adolf Hitler traveled by special train to the Allied Italy to Florence. Benito Mussolini received the Führer at the train station. Hitler had once admired the fascist leader and taken him as a model for his own political career. Il Duce, who transformed Italy into a fascist dictatorship, was now in turn taking a lesson from his former master student. He too now wanted to expand his empire.
Mussolini had two major goals. First, he wanted to make the Mediterranean a mare nostrum, that is, our sea, like the Roman Empire should be Italian possessions around the Mediterranean. And secondly, he wanted to expand his colonial empire in northeast Africa. Egypt and Sudan, together with the existing possessions in Libya and Abyssinia, should become a large colonial empire.
Among the Italian population, such plans met with enthusiastic approval. Mussolini, who had not expected war to break out in Europe before 1942, witnessed his allies subdue half of Europe within a year. Il Duce was convinced that Italy could achieve something comparable just as easily.
Mussolini had great aims, but what he didn't want to admit, only very limited means. He had an army that was not at its peak in terms of training, and his country was not prepared economically or in terms of armaments for a long industrial war. And the problem was, Mussolini didn't lead only one campaign. No, he led several campaigns at the same time, and all these campaigns ended in disasters.
In a gross miscalculation of his own fighting strength, Il Duce first marched Italian troops into the French Alps. After the failure of this invasion, he then ordered Egypt and Greece to be attacked simultaneously. But he lost in Greece, and in return, Greece took over Italian-occupied territory in neighboring Albania. Mussolini now had to ask Hitler for help.
Italy suffered a heavy defeat in Greece, and 1/3 of the Albanian territory, which was in Italian hands, was now occupied by the Greeks. Now there was a problem for Germany. The Italian ally had to be supported, and secondly, there was another problem. At the same time, in Yugoslavia, which had been very pro-Axis, there was now a coup. and the new government was pro-Allies, and so Hitler decided to intervene in the Balkans with an attack on Yugoslavia and on Greece.
Zum Eingreifen auf den Balkan mit einem Angriff auf Jugoslawien und auf Griechenland.
Über die Grenze. Ein Stoßtrupp bildet die Spitze.
On April 6th, the Wehrmacht invaded Yugoslavia and Greece simultaneously without a declaration of war. The newsreels had an opportunity to show victorious soldiers.
Fast alle Brücken sind zerstört. Kraftfahrzeuge und schwere Infanteriewaffen setzen mit Hilfe von Floßsäcken über.
The campaign in the Balkans proceeded similarly to all previous campaigns. It was a typical lightning campaign. The Germans managed again within a very short time to break the enemy resistance and to occupy both countries relatively quickly.
After 11 days, the Yugoslav army surrendered unconditionally. About 350,000 soldiers became German prisoners of war. About half of them were taken to Germany to be used as forced labor. The others awaited a merciless fate under German occupation. The commanding general and committed National Socialist Joachim von Kortzfleisch, for example, expected the soldiers to break all resistance ruthlessly. Anyone found resisting or fleeing with a weapon in his hand should be shot immediately. Now began the terror in the occupied territories.
Shortly after the occupation of both countries, there were uprisings, especially in Serbia, against the German occupiers. And the Germans immediately reacted with unheard-of brutality. Their thinking was that the so-called Balkan mentality would only understand the language of violence. And the harder they would crack down now at the beginning, the more they would have peace later. These uprisings were suppressed with the greatest brutality. There were mass shootings of hostages, and then there was a kind of graveyard peace in the truest sense of the word in Serbia until the end of the German occupation.
In Pančevo, a small Serbian town near Belgrade, a column of Yugoslav soldiers marched in captivity. Again and again, there were partisan attacks against the Germans. That was also the case here. 2 members of the Waffen-SS came under fire. One of them was fatally shot. The German occupiers then put 40 arbitrarily selected civilians in front of a so-called drumhead trial, among them a woman and a 15-year-old schoolboy. On April 21st and 22nd, 14 of them were executed at the cemetery wall of Pančevo by a Wehrmacht firing squad. 18 others were hanged in the cemetery. The massacre became a spectacle filmed and photographed by the soldiers present. The war in Greece was also short-lived. After initially fierce resistance, the Greeks had to admit defeat on April 23rd. Germans and Italians occupied the defeated country.
In Greece, from the beginning, it was above all about robbery and plunder. The war against Greece was more a side aspect of the whole event, and the Germans wanted above all to secure a military occupation. It was also divided up with the other allies, including Italy. There, sheer terror prevailed, and the Greeks also resisted very quickly. There was a partisan movement that tried to fight this brutal German rule, and then again the German violence escalated. And it became unbounded brutality, as can only be found in Eastern Europe, in Poland and the Soviet Union.
On April 28th, the sacking of Athens began. The greatest famine in the history of Greece followed. Hitler's aide Heinrich Himmler received authority to deport all the country's Jews. Here, a walk of genocide through the cradle of civilization.
Himmler on the Acropolis was a symbol of victory for me. There are only a few real symbolic places in Europe that everyone knows. The Eiffel Tower or London Bridge. And the Acropolis is undoubtedly one of them. And you see it quite often in newsreels. German soldiers, not somewhere in Greece, but on the Acropolis. Everyone knows that. It was a symbol. Greece was also defeated by the Germans. Of course, people like Himmler didn't let themselves be deprived of these staged events, especially since the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was also involved in the occupation of Greece, that is, the central division of the Waffen-SS.
With propaganda in mind, Adolf Hitler awarded the Knight's Cross to one of the members. By the end of the war, SS troops, with the help of the Wehrmacht, had murdered some 60,000 Greek Jews. Hitler left most of the occupied country to its hapless ally Mussolini.
This axis, as it was called propagandistically, the Rome-Berlin axis, these two originally equal partners now suddenly became a senior partner and a junior partner. Italy was politically, economically and militarily dependent on Germany for the rest of the war.
However, Mussolini's big man addiction knew no bounds. He was still convinced that Italy had a right to extensive colonial possessions in Africa. As early as 1936, the Duce had announced before an enthusiastic crowd the annexation of Abyssinia and the return of the empire to the holy hills of Rome. Italian troops had invaded what is now Ethiopia and begun a ruthless war of conquest. The Italian Expeditionary Army was 200,000 men strong, the largest ever to invade the African continent. It waged a brutal war in violation of international law, using poison gas on a massive scale. But Mussolini's plans for a further enlargement of Italian East Africa failed. The Duce's troops were threatened with catastrophic defeats.
Hitler promised Mussolini at the end of 1940 to send a tank division to North Africa. This was a purely defensive measure. Hitler wanted to prevent his ally from suffering a serious defeat in the Mediterranean, and the British from suddenly being able to threaten Europe from the south. Then, in mid-February 1941, the first German troops arrived in North Africa, under the command of Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel, marking the birth of the German Afrika Korps.
Von Generalleutnant Erwin Rommel, es ist die Geburtsstunde des deutschen Afrikakorps.
The troops were there to support the Italians. Their advance on the Kingdom of Egypt, which was allied with the British, had failed. In the meantime, even in eastern Libya, the province of Cyrenaica was in British hands. Now, the British threatened to take the capital Tripoli. Rommel did not wait for the orders of his Italian superiors, but acted on his own authority.
Rommel officially received the order to act defensively, that is, to support the Italians so that their colonial empire didn't collapse. However, Rommel quickly decided to launch an offensive on his own initiative and was successful. But at the same time, overstretched his supply lines and ran into major problems. And here the island of Malta was crucial. From Malta, which was in British hands, the Royal Air Force and also the Royal Navy could massively and strategically disrupt the German and Italian convoys to North Africa.
Die Royal Air Force und auch die Royal Navy, die deutschen und italienischen Konvois nach Nordafrika massiv und ganz empfindlich stören.
British forces brought in their supplies from Gibraltar via Malta, which lies between Sicily and the coast of North Africa. To disrupt the Royal Navy's supply lines on the way from Gibraltar to the Suez Canal, German and Italian air forces repeatedly attacked Malta. The tiny archipelago experienced 3,000 air raids in the course of its 2-year siege. 14,000 tons of bombs landed around the capital Valletta, but the Maltese held out.
There were always aims on the German side, and especially on the Italian side, to take the island of Malta. But in the end, this enterprise was postponed until Never Never Day. Ultimately, this is one reason why the German and Italian forces in North Africa could never be well supplied.
Kräfte in Nordafrika nie entsprechend versorgt werden können.
But for the time being, Rommel and his Afrika Korps achieved further successes in a hand-to-hand coup. Several times he ignored the waiting orders of the Army High Command. On April 10, 1941, Kyrenaika was recaptured, and the Germans surprisingly captured the British fortress city of Tobruk.
Rommel was the decisive person for the next 2 years in North Africa. Officially, he was subordinate to the Italians, but very often he waged his own war, invoking the special relationship he had with Hitler. He often ignored his own superiors in the Wehrmacht, and very often waged a kind of private war down there, but successfully. And that's what saved him from many a situation.
Letztlich dann rettet aus so mancher Situation.
As long as Hitler's favorite general delivered such spectacular successes, complaints about the disobedient commander fell on deaf ears in the Berchtesgaden Berghof. Hitler himself dubbed Rommel the most audacious tank general we have in the German army. Within 3 weeks, the Afrika Korps had advanced some 800 kilometers to the east, all the way to the Egyptian border, and was now threatening the British troops stationed there.
Rommel, with his insubordination and impetuous war of movement, shaped the image of this war and became a nightmare to the British. And he managed with relatively few means to keep a British superior force at bay.
Die Briten hier eine britische Übermacht in Schach zu halten.
The Allied troops stationed in Tobruk were initially mostly inexperienced, newly deployed units, including an Australian division. Minefields were laid to reinforce the city's defenses. Rommel repeatedly failed to capture Tobruk and eventually had the city besieged. For the British, preventing the Germans from advancing rapidly into Egypt was an important victory that also boosted morale on the home front. The armaments industry was running at full speed, although the capital of Great Britain was still subject to massive bombing. In the spring of 1941, German bombs landed near Bond Street in London, causing severe devastation. They were intended to weaken the morale of the population, but the hoped-for effect didn't occur. On the contrary. The massive casualty toll of German bombing among the civilian population made any propaganda to create an image of the enemy in Britain redundant.
The air battle for England ultimately lasted from August 1940 to May 1941, and the Germans changed their tactics several times. In the summer of 1940, they attacked airports, then London, then the air armament industry. There was a final heavy attack in May 1941 on London, which caused over 1,000 deaths. And the air war continued only in homeopathic doses. There were still a few attacks, but with hardly any impact. So Britain had finally passed the great test in May of 1941.
Unmoved, Londoners cleared away the rubble. The legendary U.S. journalist Edward Murrow reported in his program This is London as an eyewitness of the attitude of the British during the Blitz attacks. There was no bravado, no loud voices, only a quiet acceptance of the situation. To me, those people were incredibly brave and calm. Prime Minister Churchill paid tribute to the defenders of England, saying that never before did so many owe so much to so few. The few became the nickname of the Allied pilots. However, the British, looking at their cities, did not yet feel as if they were the victors.
The crucial thing is that in air attacks at least, dictatorships and democracies are not so different from each other. The belief that democracy would fight the good war and dictatorship would fight the bad war, that's true for World War II as a whole, of course. But if we now look closely at the individual forms of war, like air war, you can't see any difference.
The images were the same after the attacks, whether in England or Germany. Bomb strikes at the Old Fish Market in Hamburg. The neighboring main church of St. Peter's was also hit. An amateur filmed these images in mid-March of 1941. 100 people died in that bombing of the Hanseatic city. Such recordings were actually forbidden under penalty. Berlin was also under increasing attack from the Royal Air Force. Secretly shot footage showed the effects of such a British bombing raid on the residential areas of the capital. Again and again, the British formations overcame the German flak positions. Only the cowardice of the German fighter pilots was to blame, claimed their commander-in-chief, Hermann Göring, in order to distract the attention from his own failure. Nazi propaganda did not shy away from using the deadly threat to the German civilian population for its own purposes. Sending children from Berlin to the countryside, for example, was unabashedly declared to be a recreational vacation for the youngest.
Ein letzter Kuss. Vater und Mutter wissen ihre Kleinen in bester Obhut. Durch diese Landverschickungen sollen Kinder aus allen Schichten der Bevölkerung vor allem vor den gesundheitlichen Schäden bewahrt werden, die aus mangelndem Schlaf bei Fliegeralarm erwachsen können. Darüber hinaus aber sollen auch die Mütter, die in der Heimatfront tätig sind, entlastet werden.
After all, you sent the children to the countryside where they are safe. And the state actually wants to take advantage of that, to be able to indoctrinate the children better in the schools in the countryside. And that doesn't always succeed. Well, that's actually a chance to get a stronger grip. And you managed to do social welfare. And that was also recognized by the Germans, who saw that the state cared, that it was responding quickly. Goebbels was quick to appear in cities, didn't hide, and so one managed to keep up morale to some extent. There was depression, there was dejection, but there was no revolt against the regime.
The Nazi regime still ensured that the victims of the bombing raids were laid out like martyrs, as here in Neuwied on the Rhine. Most Germans still had no idea of the number of victims they would face in the years to come. The Allied bombing war against Nazi Germany had only just begun.